Working Cows Podcast, episode 229.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network. Very excited to bring to you an episode today with Amber Kenyon. Steve Kenyon is Amber Kenyon's husband, and Steve has been a guest multiple times on this podcast, and I have been a guest on his Wednesday night networking meeting, which is actually GROW, Gateway Research Organization's Wednesday night networking meeting that Steve and Amber host together. Been on that, and there will be a link in the show notes page for today, workingcows.net/229. workingcows.net/229 is the show notes page for today. You can go there and find links to everything that they've got going on with GROW and the Wednesday night networking meetings and greener pasture ranching and those greener pastures ranching and those things. So I encourage you to check that out. But I invited Amber here today to talk about what they've got going on at the GROW heifer pasture. And GROW is an applied research association. It is similar to an extension function here in the States, and so kind of playing that role, and they've got a research farm there north of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, so way up north, and doing some neat things there and getting some interesting data back. And so I wanted to talk to Amber about some of the things they've been learning there at the GROW heifer pasture. So Amber, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
I'm really happy to be here, Clay. This is exciting.
Yeah, very much. I've always appreciated the work that you guys are doing up there between GROW, which is Gateway Research Organization, and of course Greener Pastures Ranching. So I guess we could clear that up on the front end. Steve Kenyon is your husband. You're not his wife. He's your husband, right?
That's exactly it. At least that's how he likes to tell the story.
Right. So, you were mentioning on a recent Wednesday night networking meeting with who was it? It was Temple Grandin. You were talking about the GROW heifer pasture and some of the work that you guys have been doing there, and it piqued my interest. And I thought, not that I needed an excuse, but a great excuse to get you on and talk a little bit about that. So can you explain to me just a little bit about what the GROW heifer pasture is and some of the work you guys have been doing there?
Right. So first off, Gateway Research Organization, we're an applied research association based out of Westlock, Alberta. We do a bunch of different things. And so part of the work that we do is actually crop trials and plots. But we also have this GROW heifer pasture. And now the GROW heifer pasture was started up by a group of producers. GROW in general was started up by a group of producers in 1975. And they started as Pembina Forage Association. So their whole focus was on forages. They took over the GROW heifer pasture in 1979. And at that time, they seeded it down to a mix of brome, timothy, and alfalfa. And then a quarter of it was seeded to meadow foxtail and timothy and alsike clover. So the start of the GROW heifer pasture, it was a group of producers that really wanted a place to try and figure out what was happening with cattle, try and get higher beef pounds per acre on the forages in the area. And it really fit in with what we do as a group. And so we've been running that since 1979. At that time, it was steers that they had on it. And it was only cross-fenced into 4 paddocks. So as time went on, 1985, they decided to put into 8 paddocks and do a quicker rotation on it. And then in 1988, it became the heifer pasture. So back then, they divided into 16 rectangular paddocks. They were grazing it for an average of 3 days per paddock. They were all the same size, same spacing and everything. So a lot of really good research. And actually, I was going through some of our old paperwork, and there was so much stuff happening. So they were doing at the time fertilizer trials on it, different animal products that they were putting on, whether that be hormones or anything to try and increase the beef per acre. Now, as time has gone on, our board has kind of switched perspectives. And so a lot of members on the board are more focused on soil health than necessarily beef pounds per acre. And as that switch has happened, back in 2018, the Grow Board of Directors decided to redesign the heifer pasture so that they could demonstrate 6 different cell designs and 3 different management styles. So really exciting work. And then 2019, the work was finished and we started measuring. Now, so currently what it looks like is we have 16 paddocks. All of them are 10 acres in size with 3 different management types. So what we're doing is we're doing a mob grazing paddock, and that is right next to a continuous grazing paddock. So continuous grazing is what is typically done in our area. And then the rest of it is rotationally grazed. And the way that we designed it is there's 6 different cell systems. So we have a wagon wheel or pie system. So they look like long triangles that go to a watering trough in the middle. We have a square cell center system. So the same thing, the watering trough is in the middle, but you get 4 squares around it. Then we have the mob grazing or strip grazing paddock, which is a long rectangular paddock, making it easy to do polywire fencing across it throughout the day. So we move them a few times a day for however long the animals are on the rest of the paddocks. We keep it the same, but we're moving them quicker through that one paddock. And controlling their grazing. And then we have a continuous grazing paddock, like I mentioned before. We have a rectangular 1 alley cell. So that means that there's 1 alley going down the center and all of the cells enter into that alley, and that's how they get to water. And then we have a rectangular cell center where the trough is actually in the paddock itself. So part of the reason that we decided to go with that is depending on what your land base looks like, each of these cell designs might be more useful to your land base. So let's say, I don't know, if there's a river in the way, you might need to redesign. You can't always have these perfect squares that we all might like or perfect rectangles. So this way it really demonstrates what the animal impact is on either the back ends of some of those paddocks or on the front end. And then we put in a new water system. So we put in a gravity flow system. We put a tank up on the top of a hill, and that is fed from the dugout, which is the water's pumped up to the tank, and then it gravity flows to 2 different troughs so that we're able to feed all these different paddocks and try the different ways we're doing. So yes, there's a lot happening there, and we have been soil sampling. So we took baseline samples back in 2019, and we updated samples 2020. We haven't gotten our results back yet from the last ones, but in 2020 already the mob grazing paddock was starting to show a difference in soil biological activity and microbial sustainability.
Sure.
Which was really interesting compared to the continuous.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So we're going to back up. I took some notes while you were sharing with us what you guys had going on there, and we're going to back up and kind of work through it piece by piece, and then there'll be some follow-up questions, I'm sure, going through. But first I'll point out, I guess maybe this is kind of inside baseball or something. The other night I shared a post from Greener Pastures Ranching, and it was Steve said, "My wife loves me. She sends me pictures of water design systems," and so that was probably preparation for this episode, I suppose, that you were looking through those old binders and found that water design system.
It was. I have to be careful what I send Steve.
Right, it'll end up online. Yeah. Okay, so you said that they originally planted Timothy, brome, and alfalfa, and then in another place, meadow foxtail and Alsike clover. Are those desirable species in your area?
Yes, they are.
Yep. Okay. And you're north and west of Edmonton, Alberta, is that right? Or where's the heifer pasture at? Yeah. Okay. So
yeah, we're actually, the heifer pasture is located just north of West Loch.
Okay.
So that's, about an hour north of Edmonton.
So you said 16 paddocks currently, is that right?
That's right.
And are we on a quarter section?
Yes.
Okay, so 160 acres, 16 paddocks, 1 mob grazing paddock, 1 continuous grazing paddock, and then the rest are rotational grazing. Is that right?
Right.
Yep.
That's right.
And how many animals are we dealing with in this system?
So it's changed over the years. After it was first seeded down, they actually had a very high stocking rate of steers. So they started with 130 and they went up to 200 at one point. However, they were fertilizing every year. Then I actually started managing the heifer pasture a couple of years ago. And when I took over, it was not looking great. It needed work, definitely. There were a lot of the paddocks that just looked awful, a lot of weeds. So we made the choice to really understock the pasture and just let things grow and get things moving. And that made a really big difference. So that's one of the things. This last year was a complete drought. So we had 80 heifers and then 5 on the continuous, which work out to the same stock days per acre. And with the drought, having the pasture has been in a lot better condition now. And so Tom Kravitz, who is managing it this year, was able to come in. We came in a lot earlier than we did before. So that was one of the things in managing for the drought. And then he also did a nice fast rotation on it. And it did great all throughout the drought. So we normally get about 15 inches of rainfall throughout the average growing season here. And this past summer, we had just 4 inches throughout the summer. So it was bad. And then we had extreme heat. So we got up to plus 40 degrees Celsius. So with that being said, a lot of the pastures people had to destock. They had to get rid of animals, and we were understocked for the pasture. However, we went through it really nicely. There was a ton of grass left over, and we were able to keep the animals till October, which is really good. And then we think a part of that was the fact that we had understocked for the past couple of years, so we were prepped for it. And then starting early made all the difference, because by the time we got around our first rotation, you couldn't even tell that we had grazed anything. Like, it was higher than it was when we started and looking really good and strong. So those two things really make it a big difference. Now that the pasture is in pretty good condition, I'd like to see us go back up to a historical average of about 130 heifers. And I think that we would do a lot better. Tom definitely said 120 to 130 would be ideal for the pasture conditions in the way that they are now.
Sure. And how long are they there generally on the?
Yeah, historically it's been early June till September, probably September, late September.
So that's fairly good productivity, I would say. Is it not?
It is. Yeah. And especially in the early years, they were really pushing those numbers. So
what's the key to that, do you think? What's the key to the productivity that you guys are achieving on that place?
A really good tight rotation. So we're even when we redesign the pasture and with our grazing decisions, we're looking at the grazing concepts, and that's what we use to make decisions. So what those are is we're looking at the graze period. So what the graze period is how long the animals are actually on each paddock and grazing for. Then we go into the rest period. And the rest period is how long after we leave that paddock, how long it gets to rest for. So with that, last summer, we had entry day May 14th, and our rest period was 35 days, is how Tom managed to figure out how long we were going to be grazing each paddock. Come the middle of June, we had very little rain and extreme heat, so we prolonged that rest period to 50 days. And then as season progressed, we actually had some rain, 1.5 inches come in end of July and into the fall. So we moved to a 40-day rest period. So really managing for that and giving the grass a chance to jump back up again. Rest period. Animal impact is the next one. And with animal impact, we're looking at the physical and the biological stimulation of the animal's hooves on the land, as well as their drool, their manure, everything. That's the biological part of it that helps feed the microbial community within the soil. Then stock density. So that is how tightly we are packing the animals. And that differs from stocking rate, because stocking rate is on the entire quarter, whereas the stock density is how close. So mob grazing is going to be a much higher stock density than just rotational grazing, and then continuous is much less than that. And then the next one is soil armor. So making sure that we leave enough residue to protect the soil. And that is one of the huge pieces when it comes to managing for drought, because if you don't have a good soil armor, the water that we do get is just going to dissipate out of the soil, and we're just going to, it's going to slow down production a lot.
Sure. Yep. And show notes page for today will be workingcows.net/229. I'll put a link to my episode with Dallas Mount on the grazing principles. And I'll put a link to my episode with Don Campbell. We also talked about grazing principles with Don, and anytime you get a chance to listen to Don, you should take it. So I'll put that in the show notes page for today as well. But I wanted to kind of start comparing some of these paddocks and some of the lessons you guys have learned and things like that. So, how many are in the mob grazing paddock? Are they there the whole time? Is that their home, or are they there for just the amount of time that it takes to get through the mob grazing paddock? And then how many are in the continuous graze? How many are in the rotationally grazed paddocks?
Right. So continuous graze is 5 animals. Now, what we do is we rotate, we include the mob grazing in our rotation.
Okay.
And so we run the mob grazing the same way we would run anything else. If we're going to mob graze one paddock, like even on our farm, we will sometimes mob graze one piece of land if it needs some extra work. However, mob grazing takes up a ton of labor. So you definitely have to budget for that, and it has to work into your economics. So that being said, we rotate the 80 throughout the rest. And the plan with the mob grazing paddock is, let's say we have 3 days on a rotational grazing paddock, and then we move to the next one. We plan for 3 days on the mob grazing paddock to keep it the same as the rotation, and then just with the tighter stock density. So with that, the mob grazing, we're moving probably 3 to 4 times a day, depending on what's happening, and labor component, human resources component comes into that. And then, the rotation we're moving depending on the season and with the rest period.
Yep. Very good. So, and that's the mob grazing, the continuous grazing are each 16 acre paddocks. That's right.
10 acre.
Oh, 10. Yes. Right. My math goes the other way. 16 paddocks, 10 acres. 10 acre paddocks. And the continuous graze is 5 animals on 10 acres, and they're there the whole time?
The whole summer, yeah.
Okay. And so it gives you a pretty good tool to kind of compare animal performance. Is that one of the goals that you guys have currently?
We haven't gone into animal performance yet. Like currently our focus is on the grazing and the land management more so. Some of the tools that we're using to measure is we do have a drone, and we fly the drone. I have fence line pictures of the continuous and mob grazing, and that's been fascinating because you just see all these patchy spots. Because what happens with continuous grazing is the animals go and they get to pick and choose what plants they eat. So the desirables that they want are going to come up, and then they're going to pick it off before it even has a chance to go to late stage 3 or,
right.
They're not going to get to it. Whereas on the mob grazing or the continuous grazing, they're going to sit there and they don't get a choice. They kind of have to either eat or trample or poop on pretty much everything that's out there. And you can definitely see the difference in what plants have gone to seed in the continuous versus what plants are grazed to absolutely nothing. It looks like a golf course. The mob grazing, however, is very evenly utilized.
How many animals? Oh, the whole mob goes through the mob grazing paddock. Right. It's just different density. So then are you changing the mob grazing paddock to a different paddock that was rotationally grazed in a previous year, or is it the same paddock that's getting mob grazed every year?
We're keeping the same year after year. And the purpose of that is, especially as we do soil sampling, we want to see what the difference looks like underneath the grass. Because currently you fly the drone over, so we have the continuous graze right next to the mob graze, right next to a rotational graze. And you fly the drone over, like I said, the continuous and the mob, and there's a huge difference. However, you fly it over the mob and the continuous, and above ground, you don't see a whole lot of difference. So it's going to be really interesting going forward to see if maybe there's more happening within the microbial community under the mob grazing, which would mean long term you're going to see more benefits. And I know a lot of producers do say that when they mob graze, they see a much bigger benefit that way. Mm-hmm. But I think that all comes down to the soil microorganisms.
Right, and it takes some time to get there. You got to build that community up before you start to see it, and that's kind of the I don't know if argument, but I think it's pretty much an argument between the Johann Zietzman and the Ian Mitchell Innes. Those two guys go back and forth, and their communities, probably more than them individually, go back and forth. And Ian Mitchell says people can't afford to wait for the production to come up and lose animal performance in the process. And then then Johann Zietzman just says, if you can mob graze, you should mob graze always, every day. So
right,
it's
and I think that's a huge factor. I mean, even when I've posted pictures and stuff online of our mob grazing versus the rotational, some of the arguments are that, well, we're not moving enough throughout the mob grazing. It's not a high enough stock density. However, I think when looking at any of these practices, and that's key, it's of course always better to be moving as much as you can when it comes down to it. You know, it's better to have a higher stock density when you can.
Right.
But you do also have to look at your economics, and you have to look at human resources. And if you just don't have the people to go out and do it, or, you know, you have a full-time job and you only have 10 head of cattle, it's not going to work for you. So I think the important thing is really to just get it out there and start moving your animals when it comes down to it, and try to do the best that you can for the land.
Yeah. Yep. And that's the thing. And I think in Ranching for Profit, they would say stock density. I think the way they say that then is the highest stock density practical. You know, and practical, like you said, takes into account all of those moving pieces of economics, people, you know, what is practical on this piece of land, and what can the animals handle. You know, it can be stressful for animals to get thrown into that real high stock density if they're not used to it, and maybe your animal performance suffers there too. So lots of considerations to be had there. You know, you mentioned residue as one of the grazing principles, and that is a big one. And I probably heard Steve say this before I had my own place. I know I did before I had my own place to manage, that the mistakes he made early on in grazing was not leaving enough residue, trying to get too much out of land because cash flow was tight, and it was better, you know, from a cash flow perspective, if we could have as many animals as possible. And, you know, I started making the decisions on my piece of land in the spring of 2019. I think spring of 2020, in the spring of 2020. And so we were living off of a really good year in 2019. And, you know, I kind of did just do the math, and this is how many animals you could run here for a year. Let's say we're going to run them for a quarter of a year. We're going to run them for 3 months instead of a year. And then I've heard it said you can double the stocking rate with rotational grazing, so let's double it. And that's kind of how I landed on the number of animals we brought in. Now, thankfully, we didn't get all the animals that we said we could take in. I think we ended up with 54 yearlings and 9 pairs or something like that. So I think there was right around 70 with my cows there as well. And that was on a half section, not a quarter section, on a half section. And we got around everything. We left good residual behind. But I think what I should have done, knowing the history of the land that I was on, and the fact that it had been hayed every year since probably the first 9 mower came to the county, was what I should have done probably is just let the whole place rest, or lightly stock it and only rotationally graze part of it. And I knew we were dry last year in 2020. I knew that 2021 winter hadn't been much of a winter. And so we really lightly stocked it this year, came in late, only grazed the back half of the place, and it was very, very, very lightly stocked. And so there's still some residual out there, but I think that the more I do this and the more I think about it and the more I look at it, the more true those words become, that really just taking the cash flow hit, figuring out a way to make it work, that you can not be stocked as high as possible on the first few years, especially with a place as depleted as mine was, is going to be a big key to succeeding in this. What would you have to say about that?
Well, I do think you're right. We need to be realistic when coming on to a new piece of land. And I know that that's a question we get quite often. We got it on the last Wednesday night networking. Well, how do you talk to new farmers? Like, how do you know what to stock, what your stocking rate is going to be on a piece of land that you've taken over? And I would honestly say lighter is better, especially for the first year, until you get a good idea, and use a grazing chart. Between those two things, you're going to get a good idea of what it can do. And realistically, most of the land that's out there right now, and most of the land that's for sale for pasture land, has been grazed hard for a long time. And the key is to change it up. So if it's been grazed hard for a long time, then you want to just really be easy on it, as easy as you can cash flow, like you mentioned. If it's had no animals on it for the last 5-10 years, well, then you might want to really get out and actually mob graze or do something a little heavier and hit it harder. But if you look at the way that nature operates, we don't have the same year after year. Everything changes constantly. So I'm of the school of thought that you need to kind of imitate that. And if you start in one paddock every year, that paddock's not, you want to change it up. You want to start in a different paddock. If you have, like I said, we had about 80 head the last 2 or 3 years on the heifer pasture. Well, next year we want to stock it a little heavier, because nature, if we were looking at migrating animals, they're going to go to those areas that are a little, oh, well, we haven't grazed this for a while. We're going to sit here and graze it down. If you listen to what Steve says when it comes to drought isn't the time to necessarily be leaving a ton of residue, because for cash flow purposes, that's when we need it the most. What you do need to do is plan ahead of time for the drought. So leave a lot of residue in those years. The 2 years, the last couple of years, other than this one, we had a ton of rainfall at the heifer pasture. So growth was incredible. And those were really good times to go and leave that residue, because realistically, we can cash flow it in those good years. Hay is cheap. If you need to put some hay out, you can do that. Whereas the tough years, like, we can't find hay in our region this year. It's practically impossible. And if you can find it, it's expensive. Mm-hmm. So I think that those are all factors you have to take in mind when taking, stock of what you have and how we're going to stock our land.
Yep. So what are the practical, or what are the things that you're recording on a grazing chart? Just, I was here on this date, or I was here on this date with this many animals, or what are some of the things that you would be recording on a grazing chart that you have found useful?
So on the grazing chart, we keep track of how many animals we had throughout the season. And if you look at them, there's kind of boxes, and you can block out the days that you've done it. So there are some apps that do it. I'm pretty sure Pasture Map does something of that nature. Maya Grazing, I've used Maya Grazing, and we've used that at the heifer pasture, and that actually will print out a nice grazing chart for you. You don't even have to do the work. However, you can also just take a paper grazing chart and block off the days. So that's how many days were on each paddock. And throughout the whole season, and then when you came off, when you came on. And by doing that, you can actually calculate out, by looking at how many bales of hay your animals would eat, you can calculate out how many pounds per acre you're getting off of each paddock. And the reason to do that is the first year, it's probably not going to do much for you. It's going to be some extra work. But year after year, you can see how your progress is going and maybe make some management decisions based off of what you've seen in changes throughout the paddock.
Right. And stock days per acre, per inch of rain, keeping track of that, knowing kind of can be an early signal, going forward as to when you want to destock and those things. You don't have that information if you haven't been keeping track of it, year over year. So that's an important one. What are some of the lessons that you guys have been observing? Do you feel like you need some data back before you have more information. It sounds like some of the management style we've been talking about is a pretty recent innovation or addition to the heifer pasture. But what are some of the lessons you guys have been learning over the years?
Water systems can be difficult. Currently, our tank at the top of the hill isn't enough to gravity flow to trough. So because we are a nonprofit association, labor can be a challenge at times. And then of course people want days off. So it's not like the typical farmer that, well, my cows are right outside and I can go and move them on a weekend. I don't care. So managing around the people side is probably one of the big challenges. When there's holidays, we would like to have enough water storage so that people can go on holiday. And this is something that I would say for producers too. And I know this came up in the last Wednesday Night Networking with Don Campbell is, well, what about when you go on holiday? How do you do this? And how strict do you stick to, your schedule of rotation? And I think that that's one of the points that we didn't plan to research at the heifer pasture, but I think it is a really good point to bring up that people should be able to take a holiday, that family time is important. And that gets left out a lot because we're like, no, we have to do the right things for the land all the time. And we do. But we also need to do the right things for our family and do the right things for ourselves and our mental health and our well-being. So that would be another thing is we need a bigger tank at the top of that hill so that we can store a little more water. We did above ground pipeline for that gravity flow system. And a lot of people were concerned that the water would get too hot. We have not had any issues with that. The connections have fallen apart at times, so we definitely have to watch that because if a connection gets loose or a float gets broken throughout the season, there goes all of your water, and that is one of the issues with the gravity flow is how to manage for those issues. We have a well system on the land, so generally if we're going away or if we have a long weekend, we might leave access to that well system, but also have gravity flow to the trough at the same time. So that just in case that goes down, they have a backup. As for management, again, I think any issues that come up usually arise out of human resources. But the management has gone really well. And at this point, I think it's just a matter of continuing to do what we're doing and then continuing to measure to see what the response is of the land.
Yeah. So a lot of the same lessons I've learned. We have had water get hot, but I've never run the water under the fence line and left it there. I've always been dragging the water line around with me. Does your water line run in the fence line? Is that how you guys have routed it?
Yes, it goes in the fence line. And the thing is, so this is another key to building residue, right? The first year, it would get a lot warmer than it does now. However, as you build residue, that residue falls over top of the water line and insulates it in that way.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that was the big thing for me is, again, starting out, not having any money, doing it bootstrap, with what I had. I bought the line and then I would drag it around and when you're moving it, obviously it's not able to grow residue over it. So it did get hot, but now we've got some things done on our place from a water infrastructure perspective. And I've been thinking about that, running them in the fence lines just to get a little bit better animal distribution away from the tanks that we do have in place and using that. So, were you guys you said connections were falling apart. I had not good experiences using the, what's the name of those? Plasson quick connect valves, in a mobile situation where you're moving it all the time. They didn't hold up to that very well. I think they're great if you're not moving it, but if you're moving it, I didn't have great luck with those. What were you guys using that was not as reliable as you would like?
So that's partly on us. We have these Apex connections, and I don't actually have the name of all of the pieces with me, but they're these Apex connections, and the hose that we got is also Apex, and it's super strong, which is cool because you can drive trucks over it. You don't have to worry about it breaking or cracking. Its longevity is fantastic. But the connections, if you don't get them in strong enough, then they just pop back out again.
Sure.
And so we were running into that. Tom Kravitz actually recommended them before he started managing the heifer pasture. And so without a knowledge base of how to actually get these connected properly, it's quite complicated. Now this next year should be a lot better. For that is my hope.
Yeah. No, we use we went to cam lock fittings now and have had good luck with those. So but again, I think our water system is going to become less mobile than it has been in the past, and so hopefully that'll make a difference, move it in the right direction. So, what else have you guys been keeping track of? Any other lessons learned or pieces that you guys have been keeping track of? Interesting insights that have come out of the way I see this is experiments in stock density is what you guys are really doing, and kind of capturing some data and learning some lessons related to stock density. Is that a good characterization of what you guys are doing?
Yeah, at this time. And I think the soil health part is a really important part of that and part of the reason that we're doing it. I mean, as time has progressed, and as I was saying, I was looking over historical records of the heifer pasture, a lot in the past hasn't been done on what's actually happening below ground. And I think that that's going to be key moving forward to see why we're getting responses out of doing certain management practices. So that's one of the things. As I mentioned, we did Maya grazing. So what we would like to see is different grazing record methods, because there are different ways of doing it. The handwritten grazing chart is great for some people. Some people really like the app. We use the Maya Grazing app, and I love the fact that I could send a Maya Grazing app picture to one of our summer students and say, hey, so they're in this paddock right now. I need them to go into this paddock. And it gives a very nice display of exactly where they're going and what's there. I'd like to try using Pasture Map perhaps this year and see how that compares. So that's one of the things that we'd like to compare for sure. It would be nice to get into the animal health and wellness side of things as well. The problem is, so we're kind of custom grazing it. We have multiple contributors that bring animals in. And so with that set up currently, it's really hard because we're not getting the same breed of animals, or, it's not necessarily a fair comparison because genetics are different. And that really does make a difference, especially when you're grazing pasture lands, what genetics you're using. So that's been one of the things. And then also using the same herd from year to year for getting different contributors each year makes it difficult. So animal health is on our radar. We haven't gone with that. The other thing that we would like to see is this same study replicated in other places, because if we're getting certain results, especially when it comes to soil health in our area, well, what's happening down south in Alberta? What's happening down the States with it in the different environments? We have definitely seen, I get asked questions all the time about, well, how do you deal with this? I'm like, well, what does your land look like? What does your environment look like? What does your weather look like? And I think those comparisons would be really interesting to make on a much larger scale.
Yeah, that's kind of where I'm at too. I'm pretty surprised by the amount of heifers that you guys are bringing in that area for the length of time that you've got them there. Is it a pretty productive neighborhood? I mean, are there row crops and things like that going on all around you guys and getting good yields and some of those things? Or what do you think how do you gauge the productivity of the neighborhood that the heifer pasture sits in?
We have a lot of crops. The land that it's on right now is actually not great. There's a lot of lowland. A lot of drainage issues and stuff. So it's probably not, well, for forages, it's probably quite productive because realistically that lowland and everything can be grazed and it does supply forage. So it's decent. And the stocking rates, like 80 head isn't fantastic. But like I said, we stocked it low on purpose. So yeah, it's okay. It's hard to say because a lot of the row crops, people have kind of taken over land that probably shouldn't be cropped anyway.
Sure.
So, and everyone wants to say that they have the biggest yield.
Right. Yeah. Well, and I mean, what you do to get the yield, what you do to get that yield is, I mean, fertilize and pesticides and herbicides and all those things, so it's not really a fair comparison, but I was just trying to wrap my head around it. Maybe a better way to ask that question is do you know what the stocking rate, like here in the States, we have what pretty much every county has an NRCS average stocking rate. That's Natural Resources Conservation Service stocking rate, that the county average is this many animals per acre. So do you have any of that data where you're at?
I'm not sure about that. And that's a really good question, Clay. I think that'd be interesting to find out what the regular is. I mean, my experience is just off of our own farm, and so that's not necessarily we're not normal,
right?
At all. We're strange. So yeah, I think that's a good question, and it's something that I should look into for sure. So yeah, to see. And I just know what the heifer pasture historically has held. And I think it comes down to too how you're treating your pastures, right? So we saw huge stocking rates, like they went up to 200 head on that quarter right after seeding and fertilizing and everything. So I would like to see us get up to that point through rotational grazing,
right?
And to be able to do it that way, because my theory is that we could definitely, I mean, we don't have to fertilize it because the animals are fertilizing it for us.
Those stocking rates that you mentioned earlier sound very, very high to me, especially the ones that they were using early on. And so basically what you're trying to do is get back there without the inputs, just on what the animals can do.
I think that hasn't been a spoken goal. However, it would be nice, because even though we want to do all the good things and we want to make sure that our soil is in good health and we want to make sure that microbial communities are there and the grass is growing well, I think all of that isn't necessarily relevant if it doesn't make an income for producers. And so to bring it back up to nice high stocking rates would be ideal for sure.
Are there stated goals? Are there goals that are written down that you guys are working towards, or what are some of those things that you guys have that have been guiding decision making on the grow heifer pasture?
So currently, it's just that monitoring piece, and then the idea is more to do it as a demonstration, right? So while we do want research happening there, the primary reason for doing this is demonstration, so that when we do pasture walks, or even when I put out videos, I don't know if I can throw a plug in for the Gateway Research Organization YouTube channel, but we do a whole lot of videos out there. So when we put out a video, so that we can really show what the difference is, because I think a lot of people take these ideas and they hear some of the great graziers talk about this stuff, and then they're like, but how? Or will that work? Or what does that look like on my land? So to actually have nice visuals and to have a demonstration piece where people can see this working, and they can see, maybe some different fencing types and different ways of doing things and different water systems. And I think that's a really big key piece to show people exactly what's happening out there.
Sure. Well, Canada is in the top 3 generally of countries that listen to this. Not surprisingly, English-speaking countries tend to be in the top 3. So I guess, do you have any plugs or things you'd like to say to Canadians specifically that would be relevant to them?
I would say don't write things off just because it's happening even down in the States, right? We have a lot of amazing graziers down in America that do some terrific things. And I think that just because we have much colder winters, which we just got out of a 3-week period of -30, -40. So just because we have colder winters doesn't mean that we can't take certain ideas from different people and be open to listening to different ideas. Even if you think automatically, like your first thought is that it's not going to work in your area, to be open to listening to those different ideas and take what you can use and just leave the rest. It's not worth fighting over.
Yep. No, it's good, that humility piece. And then I think the humility piece, but also something that you touched on earlier, is the the boldness piece, and maybe those sound like contradictions, but just being willing to start and try something and being willing to fail at it. And I would say that I've been learning on my place, and part of why I'm learning is because things haven't exactly turned out the way that I would have wanted them. Like I would have liked to see more production through a drought than I did, but at the same time, we're just getting started. It was the second year that we've been managing, and so it was kind of the ultimate bad time to have a drought is after you've grazed it, at a high stocking rate, and then you have that drought coming in, and you don't get the recovery that you needed, and so it really took us back in terms of what, like, we only brought in 9 outside pairs this year, where last year we had 50 something, 60 something outside animals. So it was a big difference for us, and so that's something that you got to set yourself up, and we hadn't set ourselves up, and we hadn't had the time to set ourselves up really for those things going forward. So just be willing to learn, but also be willing to try something and fail and learn from that as well. So.
And you can try things on a small scale. Like I would tell people, don't, if you're one of the more risk averse types, we'll try it on a small scale. We did a video with Shorty Fensky, and I mean, this comes a little more down to cropping and cover cropping, but he tries everything in his garden first, right? So if you're nervous about putting your whole 5 sections of land into rotational grazing because you don't know if it's going to work for you, well, try with a quarter. We actually did on our farm. Our daughter grazed 3 horses and a donkey on 5 acres and just did fencing systems with that. So you don't have to have, like, it works the same whether you have 10,000 head or you have 5 head. So just get out there and give it a shot and try it, because you might actually really like it. The other thing I would say, if you're putting in fencing or anything, don't necessarily jump into semi-permanent or permanent fencing right away. Use polywire and some of the cheaper ways that's a little more movable, because you might find that you put out a fence and you plan this all out on paper and it looks great. However, your paddocks don't work for whatever reason. We're finding at the heifer pasture, the pie shapes especially, and we knew this planning it, but we decided to continue going with it because we wanted to demonstrate how sometimes these systems don't work. So the pie shapes, they, at the smaller end of the triangle, they come into the water system. Now, that smaller end of the triangle goes through a low area. So on wet years, they're walking through mud, and we actually have to manage around that and change our grazing patterns because they go through those wet areas. And so if you were a producer that was coming onto a piece of land like that, you might not really realize that, especially if it's your first year on the land. You might not know that on a wet year, this is a really wet area. So so if you have those portable fences, you can change it up. And then once you start using the same fences over and over again, then throw in some permanent.
Yep. And I guess, saying try it with 5 and maybe work up to the whole herd or whatever, and recognize that while you're out there doing that with 5, that when you're doing it with the whole herd, it really won't take any longer than doing it with 5. And so your return in the investment of that time will be greater and will offset some of the investment of the time will be offset by that. So it's something to remember, I guess, as well, if you're going to experiment small.
Most definitely.
Well, Amber, anything else? Anything on your list that you wanted to cover today as far as the heifer pasture is concerned?
I don't think so. I think we got through most of it, Clay, pretty well.
All right. Very good. Well, I would be willing to throw any links. I'll definitely include links to the Great Gateway Research Organization YouTube channel. Anything else that you want included in the show notes page for today?
Yeah, so Wednesday night networking,
Sure.
We are doing that every second Wednesday throughout the winter. And each time we have a different guest speaker on there. We actually had Temple Grandin December 22nd, which was really exciting. And we had Don Campbell last week. This upcoming Wednesday is going to be Ula Thompson, who's a very well-known mentor to a lot of graziers up here. So check that out. And I would also say, if you can't check that out, there is a podcast recording of it, and that by searching Gateway Research Organization on Spotify, Google Podcasts, or iTunes.
According to my calendar, this episode won't be out till February 14th, but the podcast will be there with Ula Thompson. Actually, I think Steve and I and maybe a friend of mine are going to be all together in my hotel room at the South Dakota Soil Health Coalition conference for that webinar, and so we'll be joining from the States. But I'm really looking forward to that. I know the respect that Steve has for Ula, and so by the time you're hearing this, go get the podcast, and then also mark your calendar for future Wednesday night networking meetings. It's always a good time to get together, and they're very intentional about making it a networking meeting. So according to my calculations, this will come out the Monday before the February 16th Wednesday night networking meeting, and I don't know if you know who's scheduled for that one, but in any case,
I might actually. Hold on one second.
A plug for that.
Oh, I don't know. No,
okay.
We don't have that one down.
Yep. But anyways, it's a plug. It's been great. I've caught everyone I can live. My Wednesday night schedule at church sometimes conflicts. I missed the Don Campbell episode because I had something already scheduled. But if I'm home and live, it's something that me and my wife for sure. Sometimes me and the whole family sit down and listen in on. So very good. Amber, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Clay.
Very good stuff there. Really appreciate Amber and her time. Again, show notes page for today, workingcows.net/229, workingcows.net/229. Go there and get links to the Wednesday night networking podcast. Also, go there and find links to grow and find links to Greener Pastures Ranching and getting signed up so you can join live for a Wednesday night networking meeting. Encourage you to do that. Really looking forward to next week's episode. Going to be talking with Brad Cruz. He is in Wisconsin, and lots of unique challenges and pressures there in Wisconsin as it relates to ranching and access to land and those things. So wanted to talk to him about that, but also we're going to take a deep dive and focus mostly on what he's doing with bees. And we've heard people talk about bees being the most profitable enterprise on a ranch relative to the amount of effort that they take. So decided I would talk to Brad about that topic of bees and beekeeping and honey and byproducts and different things like that and the ins and outs of it. So look forward to releasing another episode of the Working Cows podcast coming your way real soon. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.